Last Human by Doug Naylor. Read by Craig Charles. Something monumental was about to happen. Possibly the most monumental thing ever to happen, anywhere, ever. Hunched against the spongy base of the baobab tree, she gazed across the lake towards the mountains as an endless flock of hooked-beaked birds migrated across the waters. Then it happened again. The lasso of pain whipped around her hips and slowly began to tighten. She bared her teeth, and a sound that seemed utterly alien to her small frame erupted into the night sky. For a second, even the cicadas were silent. Alone, and as scared as she'd ever been in her entire life, she started to cry. Why had she continued to climb up river looking for fruit? Why hadn't she turned back when the pains first started? Now it was too late. Another lasso. She pushed and grunted and screeched and screamed, and just when she thought she couldn't bear the pain any more, her body parted, and her head thrust its way into existence. First one shoulder wriggled free, followed by a second. Then suddenly, the child slithered out into her arms, trailing a trembling neon-black umbilical cord. She held the child up and peered at it critically. It was a girl. She licked some of the ooze from its face. She could see it better now. But wait, there was something wrong. The child's limbs were too short, its forehead was too high, and its head was so large. She held it, uncertain what to do. But she was right. The child was going to be abnormal. It wasn't going to be like its mother. It wasn't going to be like its father. It wasn't going to be like anyone ever. She curled the savannah grass round her sun-gnarled fingers and looked across the clearing. Here, in a huge Y-shaped gorge, in a place later called the Serengeti Plains in northern Tanzania, she had given birth to the first human. For a brief nanosecond, Lister couldn't recall where he was. An inner voice thick with spite snickered quietly in his head. Embrace the moment, it whispered. Hang on to the amnesia, because this tiny moment of zero recall is the best thing that's going to happen to you for some considerable time. He struggled into a sitting position and peered through the grime of the porthole. He was on some kind of spacecraft that was preparing to land, swooping down over a series of huge canyons, sculpted out of a barren sea of sandstone on a desert moon. He raised his handcuffed wrists and tried to massage a sensible expression onto his face with the balls of his palms. Why would he be landing on a desert moon, with a complex of buildings, surrounded by barbed wire fences and tall sentry towers at each corner, with huge swirling searchlights? He pushed his face against the porthole and watched his reflection peer gormlessly back at him. He didn't recognize it at first, this hunched stranger with hooded brown eyes. Was this him? This guy with the 7-day growth and hollow cheeks? This guy in the khaki jumpsuit and matching hat? Where was his usually chirpy demeanour? That amiable slob grin that was as mischievous as the fourth wheel on a shopping trolley? Where were his biker's pants and his leather jacket strewn with badges and hand-painted graffiti? He shimmied across the bench and peered down the aisle. 50 bodies lined the craft's ugly gunmetal grey interior, a sorry bunch of rogue simulants, renegade droids, and Axis syndrome holograms, all handcuffed. All reluctant guests of His Imperial Majesty Thanagisserth Dane Vichikid, the unpronounceable. Then Lister remembered. He remembered everything. His face went whiter than a brand-new pair of trainers. "Told you," said the inner voice. "Isn't this the worst situation you've ever been in your entire life?" The inner voice was wrong, but not by much. Lister gazed out of the porthole, and his facial muscles accessed the program No One Home as he began to catalogue the series of disasters that led him to this point in time and space. He started to list the bad decisions, The poor career choices, the unreliable friendships that led him here, to a prison ship bound for the most inhospitable penal colony in the outer reaches of the cosmos. He'd never expected much from life. All he'd ever really wanted was to be a soft metal guitar icon, thrashing out rock anthems all night to 500,000 fanatical hero worshippers. Was that really too much to ask? To be mobbed nightly by hordes of emotionally unstable women who would feel compelled to smear his body with a wide range of dairy products and then remove said dairy products in a variety of interesting ways? Well, something had gone wrong somewhere. He'd never got within so much as a whirlwind amp lead distance of fulfilling that particular dream. Was it bad luck? Had he just never had the breaks? Or was it simply that he'd never bothered to learn how to play the guitar? Really play it. 3 chords. What the hell? Even 4, maybe. If only he'd bought that damn book that taught you how to play in a day. One lousy day. And things could have worked out so differently. He wouldn't have wound up here, stuck in the middle of deep space, the last member of the human race, literally light years away from the woman he loved and a really hot curry. Somewhere along the line, he'd made a really poor career choice. He'd ignored the door that said, Legend of Rock, instead opting for the one that said, Useless piece of directionless sputum destined to lose big time. Lister let out a sigh, like a newly opened bottle of chilly beer, and wondered when it had started to go wrong. It was a mistake to wear the tie. He knew it the minute he entered the Forum of Justice. He should have worn his oil-spattered long johns with his black leathers over the top. That would have been far more suitable attire for a man facing charges of serious crimes against the Guelph state. For a start, he would have been comfortable. His one and only dress shirt was a good 2 collar sizes too small, and it made him feel as if all 8 pints of blood had somehow been vacuumed up into his head and were trying to vacate his skull by forcing his eyeballs to catapult out of their sockets. Also, he could see now the tie itself was not a great choice. True, he had only one tie, so he wasn't exactly spoiled for choice, but on reflection, a yellow kipper tie with a woman in bathing stirrups motif had probably been a mistake. Somehow, it didn't give him that aura of respectability that he'd been aiming for, the wronged pillar of society number. Silent curses chased around inside his head. If he hadn't tried so hard to look so damn distinguished, he wouldn't have felt like such a schlub. From the rear of the Forum of Justice, a door opened and the Guelph regulator took his place on the podium. Like many of the Guelphs on Orangu 12, he was an Albarog, a bizarre genetic cocktail of albatross, bear, and frog. 7.5 feet tall when standing upright, its body was covered in a black fur, with a crescent-shaped moon on its chest above giant frog legs. As with all Guelphs, it had been programmed with slow aging genes, and its life expectancy was close to 1,000 years. The smooth white head, with its long, orange hooked bill, alighted on Lister. Do you have a counsel? I will conduct my own defence, my lord. I have made myself familiar with your legal system, and I think you'll find me a pretty snazzy attorney. Let the case begin. Lister remained silent as the offence counsel outlined the charges against him. Finally, the counsel sat down in a swirl of self-congratulation, and Lister rose and stood before the 6 hooded figures of the jury. My defence is a simple one. I wish to take the 4th sand of Doaquara, and thus be protected from the breach of Zutui by the Zalgon impeachment of Jalemnon, as is permitted here on the asteroid settlement of Orangu 12 during the 3rd season of every 5th cycle. What? A baby-sized smirk perched on Lister's face. I refer you to Mzumbliki versus Mzumbliki, and I move for a mistrial. He flopped into his chair, his head jutting back and forth in triumph. Nothing more. But this is the northern sector of Orangu 12. So? Not the southern sector. The regulator stared down at Lister, bewildered. We don't share the same outmoded, archaic, incomprehensibly bizarre legal system as they have in the south. You don't? Of course not. We adhere to the Jujuhu system. The what? The Jujuhu system, which is plain and straightforward, and can be understood by any Hinniplixdune or Tinikalakuk. Any Hinniplixdune or Tivnalakok? Tivnalakuk, the regulator corrected. That's why we always celebrate Sivbeklumhu Day, the day we won the right to be a self-governing state and were able to throw off the shackles of incomprehensible, bureaucratic legal sludge. So what do you wish to do? Take the seventh branch of Ophetye? Or hurl your soul on the great fire of Nemajuhes? Said Lister, stalling. Give me the choices again. Choose. I'll take the fourth twig of what's it? The seventh branch of Ophetye? That's the fella. A tidal wave of shock reverberated around the forum. Is that bad? If the jury of 6 finds you guilty, then taking the seventh branch of Ophetye will mean tripling the length of your sentence. In that case, You have chosen. Lister loosened his tie, unbuttoned his shirt, and removed his nicely pressed cream slacks. He fished into his briefcase, pulled out a can of double-strength lager, crossed his hairy naked legs on the regulator's podium, and started noisily slurping his beer, waiting to be found guilty. The craft's airlock door cha-chunged open, and Lister and the rest of the prisoners began fighting their way down the disembarkation ramp, out onto the landing bay. 1,000 minute dust particles scorched into his face, reminding him of the Moroccan aftershave Rimmer had once given him as a belated Christmas present. Flanked by guards, the prisoners straggled down the Aeropad's promenade and into the domed interior of the Grand Hall. 1,000 metres deep and over 500 metres wide, it was constructed from steel, glass, and reinforced concrete. Lister gazed around. It was an awesome testament to Guelph craftsmanship. Huge green and black Guelph flags hung from every wall. On each was the giant double helix of the nucleic acid DNA, and in a strange script, a sentence that read, "The key to life. Nothing should be denied." Suddenly, the vast doors to the chamber yawned open, and something that looked as if it had escaped from a really bad LSD trip entered the hall and took its place on the podium. A sickly, warm tide of nausea slowly filled Lister's body from the stomach up. It had the legs of a giraffe, the body of a gargantuan slug, and the earless head of a giant cobra. It also looked as if it had just had a bucket of mucus thrown at it. He shuddered. He hadn't seen anything this hideous since he'd last cleared out the salad tray of his fridge. The creature's huge, elongated head hovered over the assembled prisoners like a giant, spent phallus. The opening sentences of its speech were lost in a crescendo of retching and vomiting. Very few life forms ever met the snug giraffe without evacuating at least part of their bodily contents. As far as the snug giraffe was concerned, hello and were synonymous. Projectile vomit was a form of greeting. Okay, it was revolting. It was probably the most vile, graceless, deformed, distorted, asymmetrical, eye-wateringly unsightly organism that had ever had the good fortune to breathe oxygen. Well, with the possible exception of George Formby. The snug giraffe was halfway through it may sound like a bit of a cliché, but no one has ever escaped from this penal colony, and the reason for that is it's totally impossible speech, before any of what it was saying was in the slightest way audible. Those who weren't able to be sick, like the mechanoids and holograms, were dry retching. So the noise was substantial. The Snug Giraffe continued unabashed. As far as it was concerned, it was all just water off its deformed hump. Finally, Lister was able to hear the tail end of the speech.
"However, if you attempt to escape and you are caught, you'll be erased, but not before."
The Snug Giraffe paused, and a fresh discharge, the colour of drowned frogs, leaked out of the corner of its mouth.
"But not before," it repeated. "You have shared my bed."
A monsoon of fresh vomiting. An entire equatorial forest rainy season of puke. A cacophony of chundering that lasted fully 2 minutes. The Snug Giraffe smiled, coquettishly, and continued to rain its ooze on the heads of its audience.
"You are here because you have all committed heinous acts against the United Republic of Engineered Life Forms. You have had fair trials on your home asteroids."
"I haven't," said a voice. "Nah, neither have I," said another. "Nor me." The Snug Giraffe tutted irritably.
"All right. Most of you haven't had fair trials, but you have been found guilty. After this assembly, you'll be taken to the main chamber, where you'll each take your place in the artificial reality scenario deemed appropriate to your crime."
The Snug Giraffe's tongue flitted in and out.
"Welcome to Siberia."
2 steel doors slid back, and the party walked through into the main chamber. Its sickly, sweet smell was all too familiar. He gazed at the gigantic matrix of heads, all bald, all bobbing on the surface of the giant cyber lake, all wearing regulation Siberia-issue headsets that drilled needle-slim rods directly into their brains and transported them to cyber hell. He stood, helpless and sullen, while they made their preparations. A Gelf doctor injected him with an air syringe, and he felt his body buckle and go limp. Soon he was covered with the gossamer fine coating of cyber foam that would control and manipulate his senses, obeying the commands of the giant mainframe that monitored the prisoner's scenarios. The 2 assistants hauled him to the edge of the vast pink cyber lake and gently lowered him into its warm, sweet waters. They reminded him of his crimes. Then they bent down and activated the headset. The rods were unleashed. They burrowed into his skull like hungry rats. Soon they had altered his whole perception of reality. The deep sleep landed softly on the deck, and its hood hissed back, allowing tendrils of smoke to tumble out of the sleep chamber as the body of a slowly waking man sat upright, his face hidden behind a mad explosion of facial hair. He scratched his chest with one of his 6-inch-long fingernails, and a groan crawled out of his body like a wounded bear. He swirled his tongue around his mouth and swallowed his saliva. It tasted like a cross between a stagnant canal and airline chicken Kiev. His name was Retzel, he recollected. Retzel Evad. He picked up an empty tumbler resting on a stabilizer cabinet and tilted it to his lips, waiting for the water to gush out of his mouth and fill the glass up to the brim. Nothing happened. Then Retzel realized what was weird. Time was running forwards. No longer was he living in a backwards reality. Come to think of it, Retzel Evad wasn't his name. His name wasn't backwards anymore. His name was Dave Lister. Dave Lister. At least he remembered something. In fact, that was the only thing he remembered. A mechanoid head leaned in through the hatchway.
"Welcome back online, sir."
Apart from my name, I don't remember a damn thing. A smile spread across Crichton's angular face, like a stone skipping across a lake.
"Ah, you have a touch of amnesia, sir. That's quite common after such a long period in deep sleep. You've been out for just over 20 years.
20 years?
Actually, I woke you last spring, but you absolutely insisted on another 3 months.
Crichton handed him a breakfast tray.
"Here, you must be hungry."
Lister peered down at his breakfast. These cornflakes have grated raw onions sprinkled over them.
"That's how you like them, sir."
Lister shook his head in bemusement and took a large slug of orange juice. His expression petrified on his face, and the liquid arced out of his mouth and sprayed across the floor.
"That's your early morning pick-me-up. Chilled vindaloo sauce."
I drink cold curry sauce for breakfast. I sound like some barely human grossed-out slime ball.
"Ah, it's all flooding back then."
No, none of it is.
"Perhaps this will help."
Crichton turned and picked up the star-shaped guitar. I play the guitar.
"Do I have a head shaped like an amusing ice cube? Why don't you chuck out a few power chords? See if anything comes back."
The noise was appalling. An electric obscenity. Crichton beamed.
"The Axeman is back."
Don't patronise me. I can't play the guitar. Anyone with half an ear can tell that. Why don't I remember anything?
"Perhaps you need a little synaptic enhancer. I'll make some up."
The mechanoid ducked through the open hatchway. "Hey!" The girl walked into the cabin wearing a short cream dressing gown and sipping a mug of warm milk and honey. "How you feeling?" Her lagoon blue eyes speared him with a look, and something inside him buckled and fell like a stunned wildebeest. From her demeanour, Lister guessed correctly that she was an officer. Her lips split into a smile, lighting up her face like a pinball machine under a mop of uncombed pecan pie brown hair. "You feeling okay?" Lister nodded, a yes. "I've been out of deep sleep 2 months now. The medicomputer detected I needed an appendectomy, so it brought me out early." "Oh, right," said Lister, and wondered if he should perhaps have addressed her as ma'am or even sir. "Crichton did the op with a laser scalpel. You can hardly see the scar. Take a look." She tugged open her dressing gown and let it slide off her back onto the floor. "Can you see it?" His whole body still framed with shock. Was he imagining this? Or was this officer-type woman standing before him stark naked? His eyebrows climbed to the top of his head and clung on to one another for comfort. "Can you see it?" she repeated. "Huh? You're not looking. Look properly." Lister glanced up fleetingly and mumbled incredulities. "You're looking at the floor, look!" She walked towards his chair and tugged his beard until his eyes were in line with the small mound of her belly. A tiny triangle of pubic hair flitted into his peripheral vision. "Can you see the operation scar?" "Pardon me? Can you?" Lister's eyes scanned her belly and found nothing. "Look at me." His eyes travelled up her naked body and over her pouty breasts until they reached her eyes. As he arrived at her face, he was aware her lips were spiced with mischief as she stared down at the tent that had suddenly set up camp halfway down his white sleep tunic. Her hand stretched out, and the hatchway door sighed closed. She pulled the tie-up at the top of his gown and tugged it open, then slowly lowered herself on top of him. "Ooh," said Lister. "Ooh," said the woman with the invisible appendectomy scar. "Ah," said Lister more enthusiastically. "Ah," said the woman right back. And so the conversation continued until a and a ooh brought the exchange of dialogue to a satisfactory conclusion. They sat in one another's arms when a soft beep announced someone was at the door. She lifted herself off him and clicked the door release mechanism. Crichton waddled in, carrying a second breakfast tray. "Ah, Crichton, just come to get a few things." She opened one of the wooden crates and started rifling through its contents. Lister caught Crichton's eye. "Who is she?" he mouthed silently. Crichton shrugged, not understanding. "Sir?" "Who is she?" he mimed. "Kochanski," mouthed Crichton in dumb speak. "Who's she, then?" Kochanski turned and caught them in the middle of their silent conversation. "He has got his memory back, hasn't he? I mean, he does actually know who I am." Lister and Crichton cackled simultaneously and assured her that of course he knew who she was. She raised an unconvinced eyebrow and disappeared through the hatchway. Crichton took out an air syringe and squeezed off a little jet into mid-air. "Synaptic enhancer. We'll have that memory of yours back in no time." Lister's neck craned round the door as she jogged up the metal staircase. "Kochanski, you say her name is? What a little raver. Tell me everything you know about her." "Sir, you've just spent the last 50 years of your life with her." A look of total incredulity spilled onto Lister's face. "You mean she's me girlfriend?" Crichton nodded. "Unbesmeggin-leavable. But why is she dating a jerk like me? What am I, the last human being alive or something?" Lister followed Crichton down the steps that led from the obs deck into the midsection. A man in a black stretch PVC bodysuit with a yellow flannel underjacket and a coat made of acrylic zebra print fur sat at the scanner table sipping a glass of milk. His black hair was swept up in a pompadour, and he had 2 long eye teeth that twinkled when he smiled. "Who the hell's this?" he said, gesturing at Lister. "This is Lister," said Crichton. "The other human one."
Ugly.
"And you are?" said Lister.
"Apparently I'm descended from cats," said the cat. "And according to Jellohead here, I'm incredibly vain, self-obsessed, and only interested in myself. Boy," he said, suddenly catching sight of his reflection in a spoon. "I'm good-looking, though, aren't I?"
Crichton typed a passcode into the wall comp. A hatch cover flipped open, and the mechanoid took out an object the size of a marble.
"Mr. Rimmer, sir,"
said Crichton in reply to Lister's look.
"He's a hologram, sir. This is his light bee."
He placed the bee on the floor. "Rimmer," said Lister. "He's me best mate, isn't he?" Rimmer's black and white image crackled into existence. 6 feet tall and square-shouldered he stood, with a small embossed H imprinted across his forehead under a scoop of brown hair fastened down tighter than rigging in a storm.
"Access personality banks,"
Crichton murmured into the VC unit. A series of bar charts appeared on the screen.
"Download characteristics. Load arrogance."
The first bar, a tall one, was slowly filled with a green liquid, as if it were being poured from a vial to the accompaniment of a mounting scale sound effect.
"Load charisma."
A second bar, a very short one, was filled with a single blip.
"Load neuroses."
The next bar, by far the longest, slowly began to fill up.
"No point waiting, sir. Loading the neuroses lasts longer than Gone with the Wind."
"Oh, that Rimmer," said Lister, as the memory enhancer suddenly hit the spot. "Oh, God. That Rimmer." The 5 crew members sat round the scannerscope as Crichton began to outline the situation as best he could. He began by explaining why Starbug's computer had brought them out of deep sleep, even though they were still some way from Red Dwarf. Obeying Space Corps Directive 3211, It had spotted a crashed Starfleet ship in a nearby asteroid belt, and it recommended they go in and investigate. "So, where are we exactly?" said Lister, tucking into a second breakfast of black pudding and chips. "Have we gone through the Omnizone yet?"
"The Omnizone?"
said the cat. As Crichton discharged the third syringe into the cat's neck, he explained how every decision in life creates a time fork. One line of reality goes down the pathway of the decision that was taken, while the other pathway, the rejected timeline, is saved and stored in the Omnizone. The Omnizone is home to all the rejected timelines and the entrance to all 7 universes.
"But,"
the cat insisted,
"what I'm asking is, what part of deep space are we in, and am I suitably dressed?"
We successfully traversed the Omnizone, sir, some time ago. In fact, according to my latest calculations, we're only 6 or 7 weeks away from rendezvousing with Red Dwarf.
"So why all the heat to go into the asteroid belt?"
Sir, we've been away from Red Dwarf for many years now.
Lister nodded. It was true. He and Kochanski had spent 36 years in Backwards World, following his heart attack in his own reality. Buried there in his 60s, he'd undied and de-aged until he'd reached his present age of 25. Kochanski, too, had arrived in Backwards World in less than A1 shape. In fact, she'd been nothing more than her own cremated ashes. Holly had performed some miracle to equalise their ages, and then reverse time had done the rest. Kochanski continued, "We don't know for sure that Red Dwarf will even be there, or if the supplies will be intact. This derelict may be our last chance of stocking up with fresh supplies." "How long's it going to take? 2, 3 days?" Crichton nodded.
"But we can't fly into an asteroid belt without deflectors," said Rimmer. "One direct hit on that plexiglass view screen and we're people pate. There's an old cat proverb," said the cat, starting to feel more like himself. "It's better to live 1 hour as a tiger than a whole lifetime as a worm."
"There's an old human saying," said Rimmer.
"Who ever heard of a worm-skin rug?"
"Perhaps this'll settle it," said Kochanski. "We've just logged onto the ship's ident computer."
"And?"
said Lister, getting to his feet. "That ship out there is Starbug."
"Another Starbug?"
"No, this Starbug. We've just shaken hands with their mainframe, and look what happened when we exchanged serial numbers." She tapped the monitor. "The exact same registration number." Lister squinted at the figures. "How's that possible?" She shook her head. "It isn't." The airlock door paired open, and the 5 figures stepped aboard the dead ship. Kochanski inhaled the heavy musk as the rash of torch beams swirled around the decom chamber. Walking alongside Crichton, she signalled with her torch and started wading through the knee-deep mix of oil and water that covered the floor. If Christine Kochanski's parents had still been alive, they would not have approved of the company she was presently keeping. They had not sent their eldest, most cherished and talented daughter to the finest schools money could buy so she could knock about the universe with people like this. They had not paid for piano lessons from the age of 4, or Esperanto classes from the age of 6. They had not paid for jiu-jitsu training at 12, or flying lessons and extra classes in quantum mechanics at 16. In fact, they had not done any of these things which had finally contributed to her winning a place at the European Space Academy, where she graduated with honours as Flight Coordinator First Class, so that she could wind up in the far reaches of deep space with a bunch of degenerate half-wits and hardly any clean knickers. And her father, her poor long-dead father, would have had more seizures than a ward of epileptics if he had ever clapped eyes on the object of her affections. The man whose picture presently hung around her neck in a silver locket he'd given her to celebrate the anniversary of the first week they'd been dating. The silver locket that always seemed to leave a purple tide mark around her neck that was next to impossible to wash off without medicinal alcohol. Lister waded to her side.
"Hey,
"Hey," she returned their ritual greeting. "Want to show me some more of your scars?" She looked at Lister's Grand Canyon grin. "So, know who I am now?" "Hey, I was still groggy, and hell, there you were, suddenly naked. It didn't seem right to ask you for your driver's license." "So when did you remember?" "Well, before it was over, let me tell you." "When exactly?" "When?" "Yes, when?" Lister paused and looked at her seriously. "Look, I remember who you are, Kublowski, okay? Relax, would you?" Kochanski kicked out with her foot and sent a torrent of water over Lister's snigger-hunched features. Suddenly, the cat's voice cut in. "What's this?" His torch pointed to a matted fair island, about a foot across, floating on the water. He hauled it out of the water and flipped it round to look at it. He stared into familiar brown eyes, and his scream slammed around the chamber like a berserk squash ball. It was a head. The head of a humanoid who was identical to the cat. Lister waded across to where the cat was standing, his heart beating out a karaoke on his ribs. "You okay?" "For a dude who's just picked his own head out of a swamp, I'm doing great," falsettoed the cat. Crichton ran his psi scan over the dismembered skull. Kochanski waded across. "Well?"
"It says, organism incomplete."
"What a truly remarkable machine," said Rimmer. "And it knows all that from just seeing a dismembered head. Absolutely incredible."
"Give it another minute, sir."
Lister leaned in. "Well, what does it think?" "It thinks we should get the hell out of here in case the headless look is in fashion around here," said the cat.
"Here it comes now."
Crichton read the printout.
"Head decapitated by laser. Victim possesses same DNA structure as crew member known as Cat. Advice: vacate ship immediately. Extreme danger."
"Right, let's go," said Rimmer.
"Maybe there are survivors," said Kochanski. "We can't go until we've carried out a thorough search of the ship."
"Says who?"
Rimmer laughed softly. "Says a flight coordinator in the Starfleet and your superior officer." There was a long pause. Rimmer returned a reluctant salute. "No, ma'am." The cat's laugh echoed down the chamber.
"This bitch is good!"
Lister stood in front of the closed hatchway and jabbed the door release button repeatedly.
"No electrics."
Crichton adjusted the medical bag under his arm. "Suggest we go back to Starbug and return with the halogens and the mobile generator."
Lister shrugged. "I'm going to stick around here. Take a look round." Kochanski nodded.
"Mr. Rimmer, stay with him."
"Me? Why can't I come back with you guys?"
"You're a hologram. You can't help with the MG or the lamps. It's just a waste of your battery."
"But I could still come back and help advise how best the lamp should be carried, what sort of grip to use."
"Stay here."
"You don't like me, do you? It's because I'm dead, isn't it? You living people hate us deadies."
"Rimmer?"
Just don't be long."
A hologram he might be, but now he had a three-dimensional solidogram body that Crichton had ransacked from a derelict while the crew was in deep sleep. He intended to keep it in one piece. It was his proudest possession, his hard light drive, and he wasn't going to risk it for anyone. For years he'd been soft-light, unable to touch or interact properly because he lacked that all-important third dimension. But now, thanks to Crichton, it was different. His mind flicked back to the days following the mechanoid's discovery of the science on board the Lagos, a lost scout ship they'd come across, frozen into the tundra of an Arctic moon. In terms of technology, the ship was generations beyond anything they'd seen before. They even had yogurt cartons that were easy to open. After several failed attempts, Rimmer's personality was successfully siphoned into a new bee housing with a hard light capability. It was like taking delivery of his first car all over again. The joy, the glory, the unbridled ecstasy. While the others returned to deep sleep, Rimmer strutted around Starbug like a male model from a mail-order cardigan catalogue. For weeks, no mirror was safe,
and no sunbed could be passed without topping up his quiz show host tan. But gradually the novelty wore off, and after a while he found it difficult to remember what being 2D was like. Dead he still was, but now, in some respects at least, he was whole again. Lister sighed. For the last 10 minutes he'd waded up and down the decom chamber and had found nothing of interest. Now he was beginning to wish he'd gone back with the others. Just for the hell of it, he struck the door release button with his index finger. Slowly, the door creaked open and revealed the interior of the ship. I thought the electrics were down. Lister peered into the ship through the open hatchway. I'm going to take a look around, okay? In there? By yourself? Haven't you ever seen a schlock horror movie? That's what they always do. Split up, then wander about in the dark by themselves, usually walking backwards. You're making the same mistake the girl in the tight top always makes. Lister grinned and walked backwards over the floor arch and stepped into the ship proper. If you need me, just scream. He flicked on a second torch, clicked the safety catch off his bazookoid, and walked cautiously into the gloom. For 10 minutes, he searched the control decks and found nothing. Then he bounded softly up the stairs that led to the obs deck. 4 steps in, he heard a noise. A kind of low, wet, slurping sound that sounded like an animal feeding. It came from the far end of the cabin, behind a bank of bio-units that came out of the wall at right angles. There'd been flooding up here as well. He could feel the wetness beneath his feet. 1 match, and this whole craft would go up in seconds. He stooped to check if it was the same oil and water mix as the decom chamber. His finger drew a line on the floor, and he tasted it. This time it wasn't oil and water. This time it was blood. From his left, a shadow angled towards him at great speed. He turned, lost his balance, and fell headlong into a bank of hard discs before he scrabbled to his feet and nailed the shape with a single squeeze of his bazookoid. The rat splattered into the wall with a single squish. Rimmer called from the decom chamber, "What is it?" "Just a rat, it's okay." As he finished speaking, he saw the first body, slumped in a chair. The body didn't have a head. Lister looked down at the corpse wearing a pink wool Barathea jacket edged in patent leather that was identical to the one the cat possessed. A little, involuntary yelp leaked out of Lister's mouth. Next, he found Rimmer. His light beard had been shot in 2. After Rimmer, he found Crichton. His right arm was missing and his head had been lasered from his body with a cheap cigar in his mouth. He took the cigar from between Crichton's lips and gently closed his eyes. "You found anything, Listy?" Rimmer called. "No, not yet. Everything's fine, man." For the next 20 minutes, Lister searched the entire ship. The obs deck, the cockpit, the galley, the midsection, and finally the cargo bays. He went at speed, hoping to find his own body before the others returned, so he could figure out what had happened and what he was going to tell them. To Lister, it looked like maybe they'd wandered into a time loop. Halfway through the cargo bays, he found Chris. He'd picked up a trail of blood as he wandered through the cargo bays. He'd followed it down the flight of stairs and through the sleeping quarters. Several times he lost it, as presumably she'd successfully stemmed the flow, but he picked it up again in the food hall as he was passing a row of empty freeze-dried fruit pallets. Now the flow was heavier. She wasn't able to walk anymore. She was on all fours, dragging herself, slowly and painfully across the cargo bay. Lister continued to follow the trail as it wended its way round the bay and down the steps which led to the spare deep sleep units on level 2. Then he saw her. Another Christine Kochanski. She was in deep sleep, and she wasn't dead. Lister squeaked clean the plexiglass covering and peered in at Kochanski's doppelganger. Somehow, she'd managed to crawl into one of the units and engage the mechanism to freeze herself. That's why all the electrics were down. The ship's drive computer had shut off all non-essentials to concentrate on this. He peered at the bio-readouts on the fascia and wondered what to do. The old stasis mechanism on Starbug didn't freeze time completely. It just slowed it down by 95%. Chris was still dying in there, just dying very slowly. He took out his transmitter and flicked it on. Exhaustion draped itself over Lister like a rain-sodden coat as he lined up the stretcher outside the deep sleep unit, and Kochanski pressed the deactivate code. For the past 4 hours, they'd made the required preparations, sterilizing the obs deck and converting it into a temporary operating theatre. Now, it was time. The sleep unit's door swished open, and Lister and Crichton gingerly lifted the dying Kochanski's body onto the stretcher and gently wheeled it towards the midsection. As they passed through a hatchway leading to the cargo bay, she regained consciousness. She stared up into a face identical to her own, and a railway line of incomprehension wrinkled across her brow. Kochanski held her hand. "Who are you?" said the dying girl. Kochanski stroked the back of her hand. "It's hard to say, without knowing who you are." "Lister? Where's Lister?" "We couldn't find him," said Kochanski. "They took him." "Who took him?" "Heard screams, his voice shouting. Went to look. Attacked from behind. Managed to..." She wasn't able to finish the sentence. "You managed to get to a deep sleep unit?" She nodded. "Must have thought I was dead." "Where did they take him?" Crichton leaned in.
"Ma'am, please, no more questions."
The girl took hold of Lister's shirt and pulled him towards her. "Promise me you'll find him. He'll know who did this." A single note piped around the room as the medicomputer suddenly started to flatline. Crichton opened his medicrate and hauled out the heart pads. Quickly he connected them to the MG, then placed the pads on the girl's chest and pressed the release mechanism. A wave of electricity hurtled into her, making her body arc and fall. Still, the medicomputer maintained its sullen monotone. A second time, Crichton released the pads. A second time, she writhed and bucked as the volts raged into her body. A second time, she fell motionless. The third time, the monotone was replaced with a heartbeat. "This is too risky. Get her back into deep sleep."
"What about the operation?"
"Later, when we're better prepared." Lister took a slurp of coffee. "I reckon we've wandered into some kind of parallel reality. We must have made an error with the navicalcs when we were traversing the Omnizone. We're in the wrong dimension."
"A dimension where we all get wiped out."
Kochanski peered into the dead navicomp.
"Apart from Lister."
She wiped a coating of dust from the screen.
"He's out there somewhere, with whoever did this."
Lister recognised the tight, determined smile. "Chris, we've got to get back to our own reality. Did I utter a single word? Right now in our universe, the human race no longer exists."
"Since when have you been so responsible? You've never worried about the future in your life,"
replied Kochanski. Crichton walked in through the hatchway, his head slumped disconsolately on his chest. "What's happened?"
"I'm afraid Miss Kochanski died a few minutes ago."
Lister sat on a chair in his other self's quarters and scanned the room. His other self clearly didn't share these quarters with Kochanski. There was a rough bachelor feel to the whole room. Stools of all shapes and sizes, some ashtrays, some ornaments, some acting as storage jars, littered the room. He opened the metal locker that doubled as a wardrobe. A pile of magazines slithered out from a top shelf, hitting him on the head and fanning out over the floor. He stooped and picked one up. They were all different issues of the same title, something called gore. Lister idly flicked through the pages. Murder, Nazis, Satan. Lister wished he hadn't found them. So, his other self had a morbid fascination with the lurid. Wasn't a big deal, but he'd rather not have known. He collected the magazines together and stacked them neatly back in the wardrobe. Crichton stood behind him.
Don't you feel you have an obligation to your other self, sir? I mean, to help him?
Chris has sent you, has she?
Engage lie mode, said Crichton. No, sir.
We don't belong here, Crichty. This isn't our Barney. Plus, if he isn't dead, which, let's face it, he probably is, I don't want to be the one to tell him he's lost everything. I mean, for his sake, I hope he is dead.
There's an asteroid only 2 days from here, Blerius 15. According to the info link, it supports a substantial population.
What kind of population?
Pig-based gelfs, mostly. Some kind of drone species, designed for manual labour. They formed a society of no mean sophistication, and from what I can ascertain, they're not unfriendly. They might be able to shed some light on what happened here.
Lister nodded, not listening. Instead, he paused at one of the photographs. 2 figures were sitting in bed, semi-hysterical. Their 4 pinprick eyes peeked out of an avalanche of crazy foam that covered them both. Grinning, they posed arm in arm. He studied it hard. Kochanski and his other self. For the first time, Lister felt a connection. The ship was identical, the furnishings were similar, and yet until now, until he'd seen this picture, he'd felt strangely alienated from his other self in a way he couldn't articulate. But this picture changed everything. A smile tobogganed across his face. OK. He looked up from the photograph. Let's find the son of a bitch and bring him home. The night shift passed without event. The Starbug tacked its way through the asteroid belt. The cat leaned in from the cockpit. I hate to go all technical on you, but all hands on deck. Swirly thing alert. Where? Said Rimmer, taking his position. It's not on the radar yet, but I can smell it. Nothing here.
Nor on the long-range scan, said Crichton. Sir, is it possible that you could have made a missmelling?
Listen, butterpat head. My nostril hairs are vibrating faster than the springs on a Spaniard's honeymoon bed. I'm telling you, there's something out there.
OK, don't get your double helix in a straight. No one's questioning your nasal integrity.
Kochanski bounded down the steps from the obs room and into the cockpit. There's something on the Hubble. Go to blue alert, said Rimmer in a clipped tone. What for? Asked Lister. There's no one to alert. We're all here. May I remind you of Space Corps Directive 34124?
34124? Asked Crichton. No officer with false teeth should attempt oral sex in zero gravity.
I want to go to blue alert. OK, Lister soothed. He clicked a single switch, and a small, sad sign with blue alert lit up over the rear fascia. Rimmer's head dipped in triumph. At last, a bit of professionalism. Wait, I have something, Kochanski said. Punch up long range. What is it? Kochanski studied a blare of readouts. At this range, it's impossible to say. Rimmer swiveled round to face Crichton. Step up to red alert.
Are you absolutely sure, sir? It will mean changing the bulb.
Range 15,000 G-gooks and closing, guys.
Suggest evasive action, sir.
You got it, said the cat. Starbug reared under the impact of the fuel injection and screamed off, tilting on its port side. The ship banked one way and then the other as the green streak tracked them effortlessly. It was some kind of heat seeker. They couldn't outrun it. That's it, said the cat. We're better than seersucker. Rimmer's head arched up from the monitor. Suggestions?
Sir, may I recommend I load myself into the reverse thrust tube and you can use my body as decoy fodder. Of course, this would leave me splattered around deep space and unable to complete today's laundry, for which I apologise in advance. Crichton, you're hysterical. Now stop your blathering and get in the damn tube.
Lister held up a hand. "Don't move, Crichton. You're going nowhere. I'm not doing me own smegging ironing." Kochanski said, "We'll have to reason with it. Open communication channels." "She's right," said Rimmer. "Broadcast on all known frequencies, in all known languages, including Welsh." Lister's fingers spun across the console as he opened the rusting comm channel. Rimmer cleared his throat, leaned in, and began broadcasting. "This is Arnold J. Rimmer of the Jupiter Mining Corporation transport vehicle Starbug. Now hear this, and hear it good, because it's only coming once." He wiped his dry lips and then began. "We surrender, totally and without condition. Thank you for listening. Message ends. Oh, additional. Sorry for taking up your time. Thank you so much. Sorry. Bye. Sorry." The green dart of light hit Starbug with a wet slurp, then started to wrap its glutinous matrix around the craft until the vessel was held in a pulsing bubble. "What the hell is this?" "Some kind of suction beam," replied Kochanski. "We're being dragged down."
Crichton looked up. "Sirs, I've located the beam's source. It's coming from Blerius 15.
The green cirrus cloud carried Starbug through the asteroid's atmosphere and down towards a city ringed by vast golden-headed mushroom towers, before being set down in an aeropad in the south of the city. Suddenly, a face emerged out of a storm of white noise on the main monitor. It was a species of Gelth, with pig-like pink flesh, a low Neanderthal brow, and large fleshy lips.
"My name is Likiel. I am a potent and a member of the Blerian High Council. You have flown across Blerius airspace without authorization. As laid down by the Forum of Justice on Arangu 12, you must now submit to our judiciary. You will vacate your vessel within the next 30 seconds. If you resist, the R bubble will increase your cabin temperature to 75 degrees centigrade. We await your answer."
The group trudged down the disembarkation ramp. The Blerians bound them with a thick rope made out of creepers, bundled them into the back of an open-top transporter, and headed into the city. Everything about the place was basic. The buildings held together by clay and mud, the potholed roadways, even the simple one-piece grey cotton robes that all the Blerians seemed to wear. The only signs of culture were the hugely elaborate mushroom towers that arched over the city, like giant sentries. Lister sat in the back, exchanging shrugs with the others, as the transporter hooted its way through a route lined with open markets selling fruit and carpets. The sound came without warning, from somewhere above. Lister peered up to see what it was. On one of the balconies that ring the mushroom towers, a figure pulled on a massive black bell. The sound soon thickened as bells in towers all over the city started to join in too. "Look!" Rimmer pointed to the nearest tower, as two figures joined the bell ringer and started to cast rice seeds off the precipice. "What's all this about?" The transporter jolted to a halt. The guards grabbed a number of black hoods from under the seat and slipped them over the crew's heads and noosed them tight. Lister grabbed the piece of the hood in his teeth. Bit by bit, bite by bite, he reeled the cloth into his mouth, all the time stretching the material across his face. Now he was able to make out dark silhouettes of running figures. He swallowed a little more, storing some of it under his upper gum, and peered out again. The shapes took form. The Gelfs appeared to be dividing into groups of two, one male, one female. Finally the bells stopped, and there was silence all over the city. Then a priest appeared on each of the mushroom towers and played a harp, while the entire population of Blerius 15 started to copulate. Lister gulped through his black hood. 60 seconds later, the entire population of Blerius 15 climaxed simultaneously, or pretended to at least. Afterwards, they quickly dressed and went about their day. Soon Lister was shielding his eyes from the bright sunlight as a Blerian guard removed his black hood. Then the transporter started up and they continued their journey. The cell door opened and 4 Blerian guards splayed out in a star formation. At the top of the formation was a Gelf they hadn't seen before. He wore an ornate facepiece, like an Aztec priest, and a silver robe bedecked with jewels that covered his entire body from neck to feet, all except for a circle of material which was cut out of the cloth and allowed his genital organs to hang out of his costume. This was the only part of him they could see.
You have strayed into Blerius 15 airspace without permission. This is a most serious charge.
Lister began. We made a navicalc error transversing the Omnizone, and...
You have 2 choices. Go before the Forum of Justice on Arangu 12 and protest your innocence, or pay the fine.
And how much is that, precisely? Asked Rimmer, staring steadfastly at the top of the priest's head.
200 barrels of oil, or 5 bars of Gatu.
Gatu?
Or if you wish, you can pay in sperm. 4 milliliters.
Lister shared a look with Kochanski. We can pay in sperm?
Correct.
4 milliliters? Half a teaspoonful?
That is so.
May we ask what you do with this sperm?
Our species was engineered to terraform an inhospitable solar system. An ability to reproduce wasn't deemed necessary.
So you're all sterile?
All apart from we potents.
But the women are fertile, and that's why you have the towers with the bells and the call to copulate, to ensure you achieve maximum fertility. A grin shimmied across the cat's mouth.
Sperm is worth a fortune here, Guy.
Come, you do not pretend that you have any. We can tell from your craft that you are not rich. You are not emo traders, merchants. Where would people such as yourselves possibly get sperm?
Lister looked at the cell floor sheepishly. We have a secret store.
Right,
said the cat.
Which we keep in a special place.
Back on your ship?
Yeah, back on our ship, right.
I'll arrange for you to return to your craft.
Lister bowed. One last thing. For the appropriate fee, would it be possible for us to spend some time here on Blerius 15? We need supplies.
After the fine is paid.
The news filtered quickly through the marketplace. Merchants with substantial amounts of sperm to spend were making their way through the market. They had bought bread and cheeses, oil and wine, and a number of musty old volumes outlining the history of the belt that Crichton insisted would come in useful. As they trooped through the market, Lister stopped at a stall that sold candles. He looked up to ask the price of the stallholder and stared straight into a pair of black eyes that dilated with fear. For a second, Lister didn't understand the look. The Gelf was afraid of him. No, more than afraid. Terrified. But how was that possible? They'd never met. Then he realised. He was staring into the eyes of someone who knew his other self. The stallholder ducked under the stall's thin cotton back cover and started to sprint across the marketplace. Lister pointed. He knows him! He knows my other self! The cat removed his yellow flannel jacket, folded it neatly in 2, and held it out to Crichton, as if it were the Turin shroud.
Guard it with your life, bud.
Sir, you can count on it.
If you get trapped in a burning building, promise me the jacket leaves first.
Sir, protecting this jacket is my new reason to live.
That's all I wanted to hear.
The cat leapt over 2 Gelfs carrying a roll of carpet, sidestepped an overturned fruit stall, and flung himself at the figure. Lister ran up panting. How do you know me? The Gelf frowned, not understanding. How do you know me?
You know I know you. What do you mean? Just answer the question. I gave you transport to Blerius 15. Your craft was irreparable. You were marooned. And then? We got picked up by the Federal Council. They knew I was an emo smuggler. I blamed you. And they took you away for questioning.
What about my crewmates? What happened to them?
I don't know.
If I wanted to find me, what would I do?
Everything goes before the Forum of Justice on Arangu 12. Seek an audience with the regulator.
Anything else?
If you were smart, you'd send the mechanoid. Because he's more lenient towards mechanicals. The Noid's more likely to get information.
Lister's right fist arced through the air, and the stall holder collapsed into a box of plums. "Thank you," he said politely. "You've been most helpful."